Good evening, everybody. Oh. Off to a good start. Thank you, Gilbert. Good evening, everybody. My name is David Calloway. I'm editor-in-chief of USA Today and the father of a university-age student who's keenly interested in the subject that we're going to be discussing tonight, both professionally and personally. We've got a great group with us tonight. We're going to have lots of time for questions, and I'm really eager to get us started. There's a lot of important topics we need to go over. So to start on, from my far left, we have Giampiero Petrieri. Giampiero is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD in Fontainebleau, France, and on the Global Agenda Council on New Models of Leadership. Next to him, we have Daphne Kohler. Daphne Kohler is the co-founder and co-chief executive officer of Coursera. Coursera USA and all of its global operations, an emerging online educational operation. She's also a professor of computer science at Stanford, where she started everything. To my right, we have Angel Gurría, Secretary General for the Organization of Development and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, World Economic Forum Foundation board member, and a former Mexican government official and banking official in Mexico. Thank you for joining us. To his immediate right, we have Zach Sims. Zach is going to bring something more really interesting to the discussion tonight. Zach is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Code Academy USA. He dropped out of Columbia University to pursue a dream to build an online operation that would teach people what is not generally being taught very well these days at the traditional universities, which is how to code for computers. And Zach's going to tell us how that's all going. And finally, to my far right, Sean Rush. Sean is the President and Chief Executive Officer of JA Worldwide, one of the premier and long-standing vocational training operations. He spent many years as the head of the education practices at Price Waterhouse and IBM before that, and let slip to me right before we got started that he went back and got his third master's at the Kennedy School when he was 50 years old. So he'll have a lot to offer about all sorts of continuing education. Thank you all for joining us. Sean, I'm going to get started with you. My daughter is halfway through her college years, and I've already spent more than my parents spent for my entire education from 5 years old up through university and a master's degree. She's going to graduate in a couple of years. Is it going to be worth it?
It all depends. I don't think there's a tidy answer to this. I come at this topic from three vantage points. Like you, I had 4 college-age sons and daughters, all of whom went to private universities in the United States. And between the 4 of them, there are 6 degrees and $1.2 million worth of expenditures by my wife and myself to pay for those degrees, quite literally. I also come at it from a kid from a blue-collar neighborhood back in Massachusetts who worked his way through college and pumped gas and drove forklifts and did anything he could in the summer. And in the course of that, I could earn half of my then tuition. And so I rather doubt that today anybody can earn half of their tuition for 1 year working in summer jobs. It's quite remote. So it says something about the overall cost of education and the difference, both in my case as well as in the case of young people today, is they borrow money. They take out loans. The average student in the United States graduates with $30,000 in debt, and some as high as $100,000. And then the other critical point was, 1, my own experience, and 2, my children's experience. And I think, you have to look at it in terms of my own experience, because I was 55, as you just heard, when I got my own master's degree, and I paid for that. Was it worth it? I think so. You know, it's only 6 years later, but I think it was. So I'll stop there, and then I have a few other points that we can catch up to later.
Good. Well, you talked about the students not being able to make enough during the summer to pay their tuition, and really they're not making enough after they graduate to pay for some of these loans. In the U.S. alone, there's $1 trillion loan bubble out there, and more than 250,000 graduates making minimum wage in low-paying jobs. I saw in one of your articles as I was reading up that there's more taxi drivers in New York City with university degrees than ever before right now. So it is a big problem, not just in the U.S., but around the world, and we are going to take a broad look tonight. But Angel, let me point it to you. Can we keep things going at this pace?
Well, first of all, I would go different than Sean. He said it depends, and I'd say absolutely it's worth it. Go for it. And of course, unemployment among youth with diplomas has increased because unemployment has increased generally. But to those of you who have the diplomas, I can tell you the chance of losing your job is much lower than if you don't have one. This is statistically a fact. So the question of job security or job insecurity, if you have a tertiary education, you will have greater stability in your job. And of course, we measure this in 70 countries. This is a fact of life. Second, it also happens that the unemployment rate for those without an upper secondary education, this is the number, increased by 4% in the OECD. That means the richer countries during the crisis. It rose by only 1.5% by the highly educated. And the problem is that this happens year in, year out. And then the difference just keeps widening and widening and widening all the time. But again, it speaks in favor of going for it and doing it. It's just staying with it. That extra year, whatever, that extra 2 years will pay over time. The pay gap between the highly educated and the non-highly educated is also widening. In 2008, while the crisis was building up, the difference between the people who had a tertiary education and the ones who had only secondary education was about 75%. Now it's about 90%. It's almost double. So again, it pays to go for it. And last but not least, I think the question of dealing with the modern economy, dealing with preparedness, with the preparedness demands, and the associated complexities of your social engagement, the complexity of your interaction with things other than your pure professional skills are honed to a much greater degree if you have taken those extra 2 or 3 years or 4 years to do the tertiary education. So, and the last, let me say, there's still in many of our societies, although this is not the case in Switzerland, it's not the case in Germany, not the case in Austria, but many of our societies, in America in particular, I come from Mexico, in Latin America, it is also the question of your standing in society. The question, now, is your tertiary education relevant, pertinent? Is it going to get you a good job, a better job? I said, that's another matter. We got to take a hard look at that. But in society, in your standing in society, is the fact that you went the extra mile counts. So for all those reasons, I'd say, yes, it's worth it. Yes, go for it. Stay with it.
And I think we would agree that going for an education, whatever you can achieve, is an admirable quality. It does help with your standing in your society. There are many more university degrees being held now. So there is an argument that they may have been dilutive if you're not in the top flight of some of the universities, and then you're still paying the top amount. Daphne, you teach at Stanford, which is the upper echelon of universities, one of the most expensive ones. The smartest students go there. They all drop out halfway through to start technology companies and become billionaires. But while they're there, they must feel pretty special, and they are going for it. But it's really, what you're doing at Coursera now is really addressing the overwhelmingly large market of people who can't afford the cost or the time to go for it. How is that dynamic working?
So the truth is that our current audience are actually the people who did go for it, whether at an institution like Stanford or at institutions elsewhere, and they're discovering later in life, many of them, including ones who went to Stanford, that what they learned 15 years ago is no longer enough to keep them relevant and up to date relative to the kinds of job skills that they need. And so what we're really providing currently is not a substitute for traditional college experience, but rather a way for people to keep themselves refreshed and reskilled as the world around us is changing faster and faster than ever. And so I think that in that respect, coming back to the master's degree at the age of 50, that's a wonderful privilege if you have the opportunity to do that. But for most working adults, that is not an option. I mean, you cannot take 2 years off out of your life with the kids and the mortgage and the dog and the house and just go off to take a 2-year master's degree.
We got rid of the dog.
You got rid of that. That helps. Did you get rid of the kids too? No, I'm just kidding. So I think that what we can provide is a way for people to continue their education in a much lower cost, higher access, and very high quality way throughout their life. Now, as to what effect this will have on the core college experience, I don't think this is going to end up replacing it in the sense that people just stop going to college altogether and just end up, taking a whole bunch of online courses and show up to an employer with a stack of, per course credentials, which I don't think is the way the world is moving right now. But rather, I think that the availability of this technology is going to do for this sector what had been done for so many other sectors, like journalism, for example, which is create an efficiency and an economy of scale that might help do two things, both reduce the costs and hopefully reduce some of those tuitions that we hear about as escalating, and also, I think maybe even more importantly than that, increase the quality of the students that emerge from these college experiences so that they're better suited to the kind of 21st century jobs that they'd like to get. And that's by combining some of these online experiences with some face-to-face instruction. I think that's a solution to a lot of the quality issues that we're seeing.
Zach, we're seeing two themes emerging here. One is the question of cost. Is it worth it? Can it continue at the pace that it's rising with so many folks graduating and looking outside, looking for work? The other thing is as Daphne mentioned, is the new type of training, right? So you are in a perfect position to discuss both of these. What's your thought on the traditional education versus the folks that you're reaching out to through Code Academy?
So I think any discussion of whether or not higher education is worth the expense depends on the expense, right? And in the U.S., as we talked about earlier, you're looking at spending $200,000 over the course of 4 years. And when people are graduating in the U.S., more than 50+% of them, after a 4-year education, a year after they graduate, are unemployed or underemployed. So you're seeing degrees that don't necessarily mean the paper they're printed on, right? Where you're graduating and finding a job that you could have gotten without a college degree in the first place. So spending $200,000, you're not getting the ROI that you normally would have expected to get from a college degree. And that's mostly because most of the material that we're teaching isn't relevant. So education is always sort of delayed from what the workforce needs. And when people are looking at hiring people with college degrees in totally irrelevant fields, there needs to be another way. There needs to be a way for people to learn skills that are relevant to them in some form of tertiary education that isn't necessarily a 4-year college bachelor's degree program. I think this is sort of what we're going to see emerge, as Daphne mentioned, different ways for people to learn crucial skills that they can use on the workforce.
What's the demographic of your customers?
So Codecademy at this point has millions of people all around the world, and with more than 70% of them are outside of the US. See a lot of them that are young, between 16 and 28, and it's pretty evenly split. We see people all over the world in all sorts of different demographics taking online courses, both to supplement what they're learning in a formal learning environment, but also to learn the skills that they need in order to remain continually relevant.
Champero, you had a fascinating article recently in which you discussed an anecdote in which the student came to you and tried to recruit you to join one of the kind of experimental online courses and gave you one of those kind of pitches that we know so well in journalism, where he said, well, you're not going to really get paid, but you'll get reach. Right, and you concluded that you would rather get paid and reach more people, more human beings, rather than a broader, less focused audience. So you tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was just one example in which I think the example was in the context of just the question you're asking. I think you asked a very interesting question: was it worth it? And I think there's two questions embedded in that question. The one is it economic? What's the economic value? And of course, we all read the data. I'm no economist, and we know that, of course, a degree doesn't provide you a guarantee. However, it provides you an advantage. I mean, in almost every country, you can look at unemployment of people with higher education is about half the percentage of people without degrees. We know that the projections of, earning over a lifetime are much higher for people with degrees still today than they were. So if you compare people with a higher degree with people without a higher degree, you certainly have an advantage. Now, of course, it no longer provides the guarantee that it used to, but what does? Does getting a job at IBM provide you a career guarantee? It doesn't. In fact, there's been a lot of talk at the forum this year about inequality. We pretty much know from the data that about the only thing that gives you a guarantee of remaining in the upper middle class or upper class is being born rich. Now, the project of education has always been upending that, has always been making sure that entitlement was attached to merit rather than birthright. And I think even in the age of disruption, that's a project that's worth upending. And so I think it's important not to get seduced, I think the point I was trying to make in that article, with a conversation of the worth of education that is entirely in economic terms, because we have to look at what value does education provide that isn't just economic. So to assume that a student and a customer are synonyms, to assume that a graduate and an employee are synonyms, I think is very dangerous, because we lose the social function of education, the identity formation function of education, which is, by the way, not something that's only done in 4-year degree in elite liberal arts college. I mean, this is even executive education. Even good executive education teaches you something that's a lot broader than skills. It gives you connection. It provides you a sense of being. It provides you a sense of confidence to operate in certain roles. And I think that it's important, as we explore how to deliver education in novel and most effective ways, that we don't actually lower our expectation of what an education can and should provide to a broader group than just a small group of entitled people.
Angel, we've talked a lot. This has become very U.S.-centric here, but let's diverge for a moment and talk about where in the world you are seeing education working well, and why.
In emerging economies and developing countries, education is the single most powerful way for capillarity, for social capillarity to happen. It's a great equalizer. The only question is, and here I go back to Daphne's comment about what is the education about, and how long does it take for whatever you learn in university to be obsolete? Well, but the question then is, and this is public policy as well as private sector policy, company policy, and of course the initiative of the individuals. And that is to maintain yourself up to date in terms of the skills. You do upskill, you do improve your knowledge and your capacity to interact with the needs of your job in the job itself. But then there has to be a much more deliberate strategy to train people on the job. The question, we just put out the first you know, we put out this PISA study. Every 3 years we put out, and everybody's shocked and everybody's angry because they're not at the top or whatever. Or, you know, I was asked by the Secretary of Education of the United States to roll it out in Washington, Arnie Duncan. And the reason is a big town hall meeting in Washington. They say, Arnie, why do you want to do this? Is it because the results show that we are the same as Slovakia, which is fine because Slovakia does at the average, except US spends 3 times more per student than Slovakia. So there's a massive misallocation of the resources in a system which in the United States has found it very difficult even to get common standards. There are no such thing as a common core standards for mathematics or for science or for, so this is something which is improving in the developing and emerging economies. And when then, this is the skills of these are the 15-year-olds. Go to skills, meaning adults. PISA for adults. We measure that for the first time. PISA, we measured it 5 times already in 15 years. We measured only last October and put out the results. And it was very, very, well, worrisome in the case, for example, again, United States and the UK. There was no visible improvement in terms of how appropriate the skills of the outgoing and the incoming cohorts in the job market were. That means 30 years in between, 35 years in between, the appropriateness of the skills vis-a-vis the needs of the market had not changed. What was happening with Korea, with Finland, with Japan? They had the highest rates, the highest grades, and the appropriateness of the new cohorts to come into the market vis-a-vis the needs of the market were the highest. Well, then you'd say, Korea, Finland, they came up very well in those tests of PISA, 15-year-old. And there's a kind of a transmission belt that takes you to the time when you are in the job market, and that says if you did well when you were 15, you're probably going to do better when you're in the job market. But what happened? The fact that the US and the UK are not doing well in terms of the skills shows in their share of exports, shows in the markets, shows in their competitiveness, shows in their productivity. And who's eating our cheese? Well, the Koreans, for example. So the question of the skilling, the upskilling, the appropriateness of the skilling is critical. So it's not just a question of saying, 50% are going to be unemployed. It is a question also of showing this enormous asset that we have, which are the youth. What are the pertinent disciplines? What are the things that are going to be required? And ideally, not only today, but also in 5, 10, 15 years' time. The problem is not everybody can be a dropout like Bill Gates or like Zach or like or a dropout like Mr. Zuckerberg. And these are not necessarily relevant role models. This is why I say for all of us who are more normal and who are going to be fighting it out there, do get the skills, do get the extra education, go the extra mile, maybe get that extra loan. It will pay. It will pay.
So it does go to what you're saying, to teaching the right skills, also what Zach was saying. Daphne, Coursera does more work with universities outside of the States than in the States. Where are you seeing some of the most interesting stuff happen?
So actually, you mentioned that we're doing more work with universities outside the U.S., which is true. We now have 50 non-U.S. schools compared to 35 U.S. schools. But I think what you meant to ask me was about the student population, because only 30% of our students are in the United States, 70% are outside, and 40% are in developing economies. And that's not just the standard Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but it's every single country worldwide has people taking these online courses from some of the best universities, which I think illustrates this incredible hunger in many of these countries for high quality education, which in many cases is just totally unavailable. So let me use India as a case in point because the statistics there have been gathered. India wants to increase its tertiary completion rate from 13 to 30%. 30% would put it approximately in line with other OECD countries, maybe on the low end, but 13% is too low to run a 21st century economy. In order for India to achieve that goal, they would have to build 1,500 new academic institutions. Now, even if you ignore the somewhat daunting logistics of building 1,500 campuses in India, the real problem is that even in the existing academic institutions, many of the lower ranked ones, not the top ones like the IITs and the IIMs, are at about 25% staffing levels because there are not enough qualified instructors existing in India in order to staff those schools. So if you build 1,500 new ones, who would be teaching? And so and this is for India, which is relatively advanced educationally for developing countries. If you think about countries that are in much worse shape, like Nigeria or Ghana or Bangladesh, there's just no feasible way within a generation to address the educational capacity issues in those countries unless you do it in a completely different paradigm. And so what we think is that online education might be a partial solution or a step towards a solution for addressing these capacity constraints by allowing a scalable educational model that allows anyone with an internet connection access to a really high quality set of course materials, which you can then supplement with perhaps a less qualified instructor who can help guide and coach, or perhaps even just group work of people working together to overcome the challenges in the material. And so if we're looking for a scalable, effective solution for addressing the educational needs of the developing world, I don't currently see another option on the horizon that has similar promise.
Jean-Pierre, there's no doubt that we need to scale the amount of people who are getting education to help lift the general poverty level worldwide. And I was asked at the beginning of this session to talk about whether online courses are disrupting traditional education. I think it's pretty obvious that they're a part of it that's here to stay, whether they're disrupting it or not. But do you think there is anything to the argument that by bringing in this type of education, we are somehow devaluing the university level education that others who go for it?
No, I think we risk building a segregated two-tier system, that it becomes so that access to the kind of more comprehensive education becomes even more of a privilege. The kind of education that actually doesn't give you just skills, but also gives you inclusion and trust in institutions. I mean, we already know that there's a huge amount of people, especially in the less affluent tiers of society, who have fundamental mistrust of institutions. And the risk here is that in giving them access, we don't offer them enough inclusion. And I think we shouldn't be put in the position of having to trade access for inclusion. Reach is an amazing thing, but it shouldn't come at the expense of touch and at the possibility. And the risk is that what education does often for people who are disenfranchised, it offers them an alternative path to enfranchisement, to institutions that they traditionally haven't trusted. So I think as we do this, we have to figure out how not to inadvertently, which I don't think is the intention at all of people who are doing online education. The intention is not to consciously, I think it's not just an economic enterprise, it's a very altruistic enterprise. But it can inadvertently have the effect of actually essentially separating the people who are not longer entitled to a more comprehensive education, the kind that give them access to community and networks and faculty, and people that have to make do with access just to the knowledge and the skills, to the transfer of knowledge. And Daphne spoke very eloquently about the problem in the developing world of not having educational capacity. We live in a very polarized situation. I mean, if you look at the Western world, if we look at the US, for example, already 75% of educators in the United States are actually adjunct professors who work in conditions of extreme precariousness and often are very, very overqualified and very underpaid. And so the issue is, what are we, as we are disrupting educational institutions, are we disrupting also means for inclusions? are we disrupting a profession that has traditionally been dedicated to social mobility? And I think this is the challenge that we need to crack if we are to do this in a way that actually enhances education and doesn't damage it.
So, Sean, to you on that, the university education system is several hundred years old. We've seen many industries in the last few decades, music, journalism, for a couple, be disrupted to their complete change. Is that going to happen to the traditional education system?
I think the potential is there, but I think what's most at risk is the traditional liberal arts degree, because so many employers and students are saying, what can I do to go get a job immediately upon graduation? I was an undergraduate English major, and today that would not offer me a lot of opportunities for direct employment coming out of college or university. But I do think there's a risk, because when you look at the cost-benefit analysis, implicit in is it a waste or is it a good investment, is the one thing that if you stop and think about it, it's not just how much you make that justifies the expense of an education. You can be an artist, you can be a musician, you can work for the Peace Corps. I mean, there are any number of things that you can do that are valuable to society and use that education in a very productive way. The other thing I think, and I'll finish on this point, it's a parallel to the liberal arts degree, and that is, if you go back 20, 30, 40 years, and I go to my old company, IBM, they would hire liberal arts graduates directly into IBM for any number of positions. And they had a corporate training program that you went through for a year or more before you even saw a customer. And so you would be drilled on all of the aspects of computer technology or whatever IBM thought was important at the time, and that's gone. And so for the traditional liberal arts graduate, most companies are not offering that. They want experienced hires. They want those skill sets. But even at IBM, they're not doing a lot of direct out-of-college hiring. They're hiring experienced professionals with 5, 6, 7 years, often an advanced degree and 2 degrees in a technical discipline.
And that may be, you might have gotten to the core of why so many students are looking for jobs right now. Big corporations, companies are not doing as much of that type of hiring anymore. But I bet you at IBM they would be interested these days in some of the folks graduating from Code Academy. So Zach, what, where do you find the folks who are taking your courses end up going when they graduate?
I think they go to a whole variety of places. We see people that both are learning just for the sake of learning, but also people that end up at companies like Google, end up at companies like IBM. And I think that the danger of the conversation that we're having is really conflating education and learning with universities, right? And I think the important thing to think about here is that the college degree is not necessarily the holy grail, but the skills are, and it's what you learn that is. And so when you talk about sort of the disruption of higher education, I think what we're seeing is different delivery mechanisms for the same types of material, right? So maybe you won't spend 4 years on a college campus, but maybe you'll learn similar skills that you would have learned on a college campus on a website like Code Academy. And maybe your results will be better and you'll spend less money on doing so. And so I think the risk in all of this is actually relying on existing institutions to provide us with new and different types of value that they haven't had to provide in the past. I think as private companies like Daphne's and mine try to provide new and interesting solutions here, it seems that universities can't adapt fast enough.
That is a good point. You can, at least online, you can measure progress. You can go at your own speed. And somebody that with an online accreditation, the job hirer knows what they're getting, right? Daphne, I wanted, in our few minutes before we open up to questions, to examine one of the more controversial aspects of online education, which goes to Coursera, and that is the recent fad of MOOCs, of massive open online courses. A lot of colleges have been experimenting with them. There have been recent press clippings that they haven't produced enough results in terms of folks finishing, or even, if you wanted to make a big deal of it, any sort of a business strategy for folks like Coursera. What do you think about the future of MOOCs and how will they develop? They're quite new still, just a few years old.
Right. So first of all, let me say that MOOCs are just about 2 years old. We at Coursera started operations 2 years ago this week. So it's a very new phenomenon. You actually asked two questions. The first is the one on retention rates, and the second is the one on the business model. So if you don't mind, I'll answer them separately. The question on retention rates, I think, really boils down to a tremendous misconception on what the numbers really mean. If you look at the people who enroll in a course, it's analogous to going through the course catalog of, say, Columbia University, saying, that one sounds interesting, let me put an X next to that one, and then that one sounds interesting, and that one sounds interesting too. How many of those end up actually corresponding to a full course completion? A relatively tiny fraction. So what we're seeing is that a lot of people sign up on this for pure interest. They maybe watch a few lectures, maybe they watch all the lectures, but don't want to submit a single assignment because that's not what they're in there for. They just want to get a sense for the material. So a much better question is, of the people who enroll in the course with an intent to complete, how many actually complete the course? So if you ask people about their intent, maybe about 2 or 3 weeks into the class after they've had a chance to see what the material is like, and look at the population that had a strong intent to complete, the completion rates are in the mid-60s. If they mid-60s. If you add to that, if you then ask also, look at the population, in addition to that, paid a modest amount, $50, so just enough to put a little bit of skin in the game, completion rates get close to 90%, 88%. Now, 88% is high for any online activity, including social games, far less something that requires 5 to 7 hours of homework every week. So the fact that you have that level of completion, I think, is an indication of success rather than a failure. And I think just speaks to the fact that the denominator, that is the population that we're looking at, is just the wrong population for computing completion rates. And then when you consider the fact that in each of those courses you have thousands, literally thousands of people completing, and in a typical college class you might have a couple dozen, I think it speaks to the scalability and value of offering this education to a much larger number of people. So that's to your first question. The one about business models. You know, most internet companies are not asked to produce a business model until year 6. We're at year 2. Nevertheless, we actually have a business model that's producing decent amounts of revenue. We have put in place a concept by which people don't pay for access to the course, but pay for the accreditation, the credential at the end. It's completely optional. You can still take the course for free, but if you want a verified credential that you can present to an employer so that you can get a job at IBM or Google, then you pay that $50 that I mentioned earlier. So it's a modest amount. We also have a financial aid option so that if you live in Ghana and you can't afford $50, you can still get access to the credential. And within the first 6 months of operations, even though we were ramping it up really slowly, this made over $1 million. And the rate at which it's accruing revenue is only speeding up. So we think that credentialing, especially as these credentials start to pick up credibility in the marketplace and companies start taking them seriously, as you would think they would, because if you're looking at 2 people who got degrees 15 years ago, one of whom has 3 courses from, you know, Stanford, Princeton, and Caltech, and the other one doesn't, which of them would you interview? And so we think that these are gaining more and more credibility in the marketplace, and as such, the uptake is going to go up. And we think this is actually a sustainable revenue model that's going to allow us to continue to offer free education.
And you're clearly making more than Snapchat is making right now.
That is true.
Angel, you want to address?
Them.
Yeah, I'd like to underline what Zach said. This is simply a different way of delivering the product. The word disruption was used several times vis-a-vis the traditional way of delivering tertiary learning. And I think that instead of having to build how many thousands of campuses, you said, in India?
1,500.
1,500? You know, this can be
Exactly.
a way in which you don't have to build the bricks and the mortar. You probably can't, not overnight, but in which you can deliver the product. And then you will increase India's productivity, and you will increase India's competitiveness, and they will be, better prepared, etc. So I think this is quite. Now there is a question of dropouts, yes, and there's a question of the business model, the sustainability of the effort, and I would say that because it's so young, the business models are not yet clear, content, etc. But the next generation of MOOCs, in a way, have to find a more advanced concept of educational design, need to integrate learning analytics and provide students with the right abilities. But again, you come to the question of the pertinence, the relevance, the impact of what it is that you are trying to learn. And here, let me just say, we had a personal experience. Our daughter was doing a master's degree in Harvard, and then her husband moved to New York to, get a job there, and she had to move too. And she completed her master's online, and she got her. Then she went to final exam or whatever, But basically, the gap there in the family, the big problem that they presented themselves was filled with the online capacity. And here I'm talking about massive, and I'm talking not only about the Indias of this world, which speak English and have this goal for the excellence. They want the completion rate. It's important for them. But just to spread even more basic knowledge throughout the world. So the use of technology, I would fully agree. I think this is a pearl of wisdom that Sachs has offered to us, that these ways are not different. They are not substantially a different product. They just have a different way in which they're being delivered. And the other thing he said, which I would also subscribe, is that the skills that you acquire are critical, because we, as I said, have measured the fact that skills are not appropriate. And I don't know, maybe too many economists, too many lawyers, whatever, they still want to be interviewed by McKinsey or by the big law firms and make $1 million out of school. This is not your typical, situation.
Zach?
I think, so we've talked about disruption of higher education again. We've talked about how all of this is changing, right? The biggest shift that we've seen in making education more efficient is getting rid of all sort of the detritus of the offline model, right? When you look at a university in the United States, you have sports teams, you have housing, you have real estate. And what you can do when you bring that online is eliminate all of those things and sort of just think about the way the business model changes. But I think the other thing that we should start doing, we talk about sort of the evolution of MOOCs. I think we should even move beyond the concept of MOOCs to begin with, right? I think learning is totally different online and totally different with mobile devices than it is in a classroom, right? So the delivery mechanism doesn't even need to be a course, right? It can be sort of small, bite-sized pieces of content that teach you what you need, when you need to learn it, tailored to each of the individuals. So I think we're still in really the early days for how this material is delivered online. If you look back in the late 90s and you saw that sort of banner ads were the first implementation of the first implementation of advertising, was let's take something from offline and bring it online. And I think that's the first step of what we're doing now is taking offline constructs of education and bringing them online. And I think the more we evolve, the more Coursera evolves, what you'll start to see is really native forms of education, is sort of this bite-sized delivery of the skills that matter when you want them, customized and personalized to you, not even in the course format that you've seen before.
So, Jean-Pierre, take out your crystal ball and look 20 years from, or 18 years from now, to a baby who's born this week. What is the university system going to look like in a combination of professors and online?
Very quickly. I mean, there always be a blend. I think, first of all, MOOCs are here to stay, as is a variety of ways, and MOOCs have done a lot of good. One is they've made education cool. They've really brought a global conversation about this is a human right, how do we give as many people as possible access to it? There are issues of implementation, as Daphne says, certainly some kind of blended model. Any university that isn't preparing for some kind of blended model is dooming itself to extinction, first of all. Second, I want to say I'm a little bit concerned, though, about this idea, this very optimistic idea of let's go to this country which doesn't have educational capacity and let's give them ours because we have it, we have excess capacity, we're very good at it. Because the key question, I think the proof of the metal in this business of exporting culture, we've tried in other domains and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think the question is, does it liberate, does it accelerate the creation of a class of educators in this country, or does it slow it down? Because if it slows it down, the word for that is not a very nice word, but it's basically colonialism. If it accelerates it, instead, it's capacity building. And so I think that's going to be the test of these very good intentions. 2, 3, completion rates. Completion rates are great. are amazing, and I think if people have good intent, many of us are on this stage because we met professors that some of professors I had, if I had a chance 3-4 sessions in to click and close that window, I would have, because they really irritated me. But then they changed my life, and because I didn't have the possibility of closing. So how we not just measure people intention, but actually how we generate intention is very important. I completely agree that a small percentage of a huge number is an amazing thing. But I think we have to look at what's the composition of that small percentage. Is that small percentage just people who have an incredibly high motivation for education? Because we know that that's not distributed across all social strata. Usually people who are already more educated or usually more affluent or from upper classes tend to be more motivated to stick with education than people who don't have that sort of endurance for the educational enterprise. And then the last question, which we haven't touched here, is governance. So one of the things that Sean was saying, of course, the rise of this desire for education and the rise of the discourse that a university should develop employees, and Jennifer and I researched this, as that you can actually match it with the decrease of how much socialization and training corporations offer. So one of the things that we've researched is the less organization take care of your own personal and professional development, the more people look at educational institutions as identity workspaces. People where they go to change their status in society, to acquire skills, and to become a different person. So this enterprise is made by a different set of organization that is no longer governed by the nation state or some kind of combination of alumni and public sector, but is fundamentally governed by the private sector. What assures us who will they be working for? So I think one of the questions that we haven't talked about here is who does the education sector work for, not in terms of the student, but actually the people who fund it, and what will they demand? And as I said at the beginning, to actually make the education sector essentially an educational subsidiary of the corporate sector, I think it doesn't bode very, very well for the democratic enterprise.
Seems a bit dangerous. Daphne, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, so first I'd like to speak to the issue of capacity building, which is, I think, a very important point that you raised. I actually, just looking at the kind of uses of the content that we're seeing, it actually does build capacity. I'll give you an example that's close to home for me, but I think transcends, where you had a group of high school students who were taking one of our intro programming classes online and as an after-school activity, and they were being facilitated by a math teacher in their school who had not had any programming experience before. But he was taking the class together with his students and learning the material together with them, but also asking them questions, leading the discussion and guiding them. And you can easily see that the next time that he had a group that was wanting to learn the material, he would be more experienced and more able to do that. And by the third or fourth time, he might be able to teach a lot of it on his own without even needing the MOOC. And so I think that there is hope for capacity building in this facilitated model. Now, I just wanted to respond to your last point. I'm not entirely sure if you were trying to argue that the involvement of the private sector, people like Zach and myself in education, is a problem or not.
No, I don't think I'm saying it's a problem or not, but I think there's question around where is the governance? Because I think what you're doing is something that's bigger than just changing delivery. I think what you're doing is accelerating the decoupling from the educational project from the nation state. Mm-hmm. And I think we know today with globalization that this is inevitable, that education may not longer, the Professor Mitchell, a colleague of yours at Stanford University, talks a lot about this, the fact that the more people acquire a global outlook, the less educational institutions that are tethered to just a national outlook are inadequate. But then the question is, who governs those institutions? Who governs Coursera? Who does Coursera work for? And who does it respond to when it makes curriculum choices, when it decides who's going to be taught and who gets to teach, the diversity of the professors you have, and all of that? So
we don't. The universities do, and that's something that distinguishes our model. So the governance on the academic side stays with the academics where it belongs.
I'm going to let you guys throw some questions to the panelists in a few minutes, but before I do that, I want to just ask if any of the panelists over on this side have any questions for any of the other panelists.
I'm fine. I'd like to hear from the audience.
All right, let's go. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. Michele Ozza, I'm from UCM European Chamber. Very simply, I think that the availability of online courses will strongly damage formal institution for teaching, just as much as availability of book did. What do you think about that?
Who's that for? The whole group?
I'll take a shot at that because I
Okay.
was thinking about it as others were speaking. I wouldn't put a number on it per se, but I think there will be a dramatic decrease over time in the number of institutions of higher learning. They will either merge or go out of business because their cost structures just don't work. But more importantly, I think these disruptive technologies, and I don't mean just technology, but these disruptive models are going to take their place in many cases. The great institutions will always be there, I suspect, because they are fairly resilient and have the financial wherewithal to persevere. But I think a lot of marginal institutions will not make it and will succumb to any one of the models that have been discussed here this evening.
Next question. Second row in the middle. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jacopo Cati. I'm going to be a college student soon, I hope. And my question is to all of you, because it's a question of opinion, and I hope everybody has one on this topic that I'm going to ask. And so Ms. Kohler said that about 30% would be pretty low for OECD countries.
13.
Or 15, but
13.
India wants...
13 would be very low.
Yeah, but India wants
30 is within range, yes.
Yeah, but that's as well pretty low for the countries in the OECD. But if you look at Switzerland today, it doesn't have even 30, it's about 20 to 25%, because the other kids do apprenticeship instead of colleges. And that's actually a place, like Mr. Roche said, for example, IBM, where the company teaches the students the skills that it wants them to have of the course of over 3 or 4 years. So are we just going the wrong way if we just like make the college degree more accessible? And just because if everyone goes a mile, how much is the mile worth? You know?
So I think we have this, I think most of us have this romanticized notion of what higher education means, right? And as you mentioned, you might learn the same from an apprenticeship, or better, how to work than you might in college. And college definitely can shape the way you think, perhaps differently than how an apprenticeship does. But I think what we're really seeing here is that a lot of universities might go away, but education is not going away, right? As more people have apprenticeships, more people find different forms of education, those are just as adequate to substitute to higher education as.
The question of the university's is shown by the fact that if the 30% number of completion is the one that is, let's say, the average in the OECD, that means 70% don't. And what do you do with the other 70%? Today, we had a big discussion about the fact that, first of all, not everybody, wants or will or can go to university. But if you want to go the extra mile, they called it Master of Apprenticeship. And then some of the big CEOs in the room said, but the problem is that apprenticeship is a very bad word in the Anglo-Saxon culture because it's kind of a lower, message. I was insisting that we keep. So they invented something like Master of Artisanship, which is a terrible name, and it looks like you're doing handicrafts all the time. But effectively, what they were trying to say and do, how do you upgrade those that will not get the university degree, that will not get the diploma, or that maybe will not be pertinent, maybe will get the diploma but not necessarily have the skills, and therefore cannot plug into the job market? And what do you do with them? And how do you at the same time kind of rescue both their self-esteem and the perception of the public, the perception of the family, the perception of the market in terms of how much they are worth? So this is an issue. And then one of the big guys there said, well, if we could do that, I think I could accommodate 20,000 of the guys that could be coming out of those courses, 3-year courses but when they said, what do we teach? They went back like Daphne to say, we go back to the universities, we go back to the technical colleges to tell us what it is that continues to be relevant. This continues to be critical. As I said before, we got 30%, maybe you're all of the golden youth that could do it, but 70% don't get there. And therefore, for them, there has to be an institutional setup, which today does not really exist in a very organized form in many of our societies.
Gentleman in front.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christian Raleigh. I'm a student at Yale University and a reporter here, for student reporter. Actually, I think that was an excellent question. Thank you. I want to continue with this a little bit. Talk about, don't you think the higher education industry has been facing a lack of competition? I would say a lack of alternatives, especially in countries like the United States. I come from Switzerland. There is an alternative to higher education. As you said, you can go do an apprenticeship. Is there a lack of competition to the higher education industry in the United States? And could online learning or apprenticeship bring this competition a bit higher?
It's a great question. Sean, Zach, you want to take it?
Go ahead, Zach.
I think, you mentioned this before, that we're seeing, in other industries, we've seen disruption happen in a similar way, right? You see Napster come along, and then the music industry has to change. And in education, you're seeing companies like Coursera and companies like Codecademy come along and force market innovations happening in education. And if anything, this has forced universities to reevaluate their own models and forced universities to change their budgets, change the way they teach. In the US, the past 30 or 40 years, the costs of administration for universities have risen much faster than the costs of faculty. And this just seems to make no sense, right? The learning isn't improving with the way we were making investments. And so now that they're facing competition from the free market and from companies like ours, I think it will only drive universities to become better and provide more credible alternatives to people.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that I think for most traditional institutions of higher learning, change is very difficult. There's the old joke about the Oxford Dons, and it was, how many Oxford Dons does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer was, change. What's change? So it's often very, very difficult at these traditional institutions.
In journalism in the States, at USA Today, we have a very interesting, it's not quite an apprenticeship program, but it is an advanced internship program. And we take students from a diversity of schools and really throw them in and choose from the best of that lot on how they develop. So it is still a form of what you were talking about in the old IBM days. It's less of a financial commitment, but it is still a form of it. And I think you both hit on the fact that the apprenticeship, whatever you call it, in some way is going to continue to grow as the demand for specific skills in these areas grows.
I'd like to just respond to Sean's point, because I think people ask me what I've found most surprising about the last 2 years of MOOCs and Coursera. And I think the single most surprising thing to me has actually been the rate at which universities have picked this up and have run with it. I was not expecting that. I was thinking maybe in 3 years we'll have 15, 20 universities on board, and it's been less than that, and there's 110 of them. And I think that there's a sense out there of urgency and a realization that we are at the cusp of a huge transformation, and that either you're on the train or you're off the train and are going to be left behind. And so I agree with you in principle. I mean, these are institutions that by and large have not changed for decades, sometimes centuries, but somehow there's a sense that this is different now. And I don't know what made that happen, but it's certainly happening.
I think we also have to dispel the myth that this is the first. So one is, there's two assumptions there. One is it's the first time that the education sector in the United States has had a challenge from the private sector, and that is not true, because there have been for-profit universities who actually are the major source of loan default among all the U.S. educational institutions. I think we have to distinguish the for-profit educational institutions and the non-for-profit. There's some very interesting sociology work done in the U.S. by Tracy McMillan Cotton on this, who looks at the differences. And the second thing, as Daphne was saying, is I wouldn't necessarily assume that this is a competitive enterprise, because I think there's many universities that look at this as an opportunity to actually upskill their own faculty and their own offering, to the point where I think we also need to ask ourselves where some universities, especially elite universities, are using this as a way not to change. As a way to say, well, if we have some star faculty and we can put them online, maybe we can just keep doing the same old thing. And so there's two assumptions that I would like to challenge and also join. So I think the need for educational institutions to change profoundly, and the need for those who fund and govern those educational institutions to also pressure them remains very high, despite the challenge from this new corner of the private sector.
I think your question was really well founded, because whenever you introduce real competition, be it the for-profits or the onlines, there is, as Sean was saying, a contraction in the industry as the better ones rise up. And I think you're going to see, I mean, for instance, do we need 3,000 universities in the United States where you can teach, where Shakespeare is taught, right? Maybe there's actually better ones. There'll be more competition for that, and that could end up being an online course going forward. I'm interested in finding out a little bit more about how, years from now, professors at universities will use online, whether they will give a lecture and have the online be the follow-up, or whether the online will be the lecture and they will be presenting themselves for questions, for instance, in a specific area. You think it's the latter?
It's not just questions, it's facilitating and guiding discussion, enabling people to develop critical thinking skills, debate skills, problem-solving skills. But I think the delivery of content is going to be relegated to the online format, where people can do it at their own time, at their own pace, stop and take notes, exercise some basic skills so that they interact actively with the material rather than just sit there taking notes. And then the part in class is going to be the more cognitively challenging part, which really needs a human there who understands what's going on and can help guide the students through it.
More questions? Back by the speaker.
Thank you. My name is Sabine Schilling, ETH Zurich, physicist, one of these old-fashioned institutions. So, first remark: I hate the idea of of combining economy with education, because for me education is something like a human right, where I would like to have that everyone have it. Emerging countries have problems with that, so I think Coursera is a great step. When you say that you can a lot of comments to your thing that with the online course you can stop it, take your pace, and then go to this. Books were always there. That's the definition of a textbook. This is nothing new. Libraries always existed, so I think there it's very similar. But I had a big dichotomy on the panel, which is education versus skill sets. I think education, you need peers. Education, you need a senior person, normally professor, your peers. You have to discuss about it. You have to wander around. I think what formed me were the years at the university where I wasn't thinking, does any kind of employer need that skill set, or I want to learn that for the pure curiosity. And that formed me, and that gave me the basis now to learn a ton of other things very quickly, but this was an opener. And I think universities can give that. So I think education is one thing, and there I need peers, and the others are skill sets. And if I have to learn C++ object-oriented programming, and I have to fetch it up, I think Coursera is great. So I think as the television didn't kick out the books, Coursera won't kick out the traditional universities. I think there's room for everything, just for what you need, and there's place for everyone.
And that's those are several good points. But I think, part of and Jean-Pierre pointed to that before, that it's really, when you start to put ROI on an education, you tend to add a lot of conflicts. However, the I is definitely growing out of control. And that is something, if there was one thing, as Angel said, if you can just have a set of standards and the nations provide that education, but it's not going that way. And it's the investment that's growing out of control, and that's going to become a major issue if we don't address it soon. Next question. All right, over there.
Thanks. My name is Thomas Julia. I live in Germany. Youth unemployment is a very big issue, especially in Europe. On the other side, the OECD has the PISA report. And we look at countries which rank very high, and we look at the rates of the youth unemployment. They're not really in sync. So the question is, do we still have this correct priorities, or isn't it time that we double check our assumptions when we publish such reports?
Well, first of all, what we measure in PISA is not what you know, but what you do with what you know. How do you apply it? How do you face real life situations with what you have known and accumulated in knowledge over time? So this question of learning, needing a mentor, somebody who guides you, somebody who tells you what to do with the knowledge, what is it about, how the world is out there, the real world out there. This is something which comes with tutoring, which maybe, can be provided online somehow, but which today appears to be more on the side of what you're calling the traditional universities. I, by the way, Sean, regardless of your joke on the changing the light bulb, we say what has changed. I think in universities, not in every university, but is where most of the change has taken place since the Middle Ages and today. Now, the fact that people like Zach or people like Daphne are sort of creating a competitive edge in creating new products and new ways of delivering the product, I think is fine, because what is going to happen, I think, is not that they're going to be disappearing. I think they're going to be absorbing and adopting, and that you're the guys who are going to have more competition, because the big guys are going to make this their mainstream or part of their mainstream offer, and they're going to be doing this more and more and more. So I'd say that that this is kind of the way we see the future evolving going forward. But going back to PISA, as I said, we measure what you do with what you learned over time, but you say, but the young are the highest unemployed, therefore something is wrong. Well, no, it's actually quite consistent, because right now youth unemployment is very high on the average, is very high in Greece, and is very high in Spain, but it is lower than before the crisis in Germany, or here, or in Austria, or in Finland. So I want to say this, maybe in Finland it's picked up, by the way. But there's a question here of a certain consistent results. And that is, when you get it right, those countries that do better at the PISA test, which then, as I said, came out better in the skills test, are doing better in the employment-unemployment equation in the market in reality. And that means they're doing something right. And what they're doing right is there are certain unifying common features, whether it's Shanghai, Canada, or Finland, or Korea, four completely different countries with completely different setups, completely different governance issues, etc. What they have in common are 4, 5, or 6 basic features, and then they get better results because they have those things in common, even if culturally they are so different. So I would almost say exactly the opposite to what you said. The results of the PISA test bear out the fact of how important it is to get it right. And it starts from early childhood, by the way. Those who had early childhood, 1 or 2 years, do much better when they're 15, and the 15-year result carries on to university. So you're talking about a whole chain of events here. The knowledge chain starts in early childhood and goes all the way to tertiary education. And the more you get of it, the better off you will be.
All right, let's get a question in the way back, in the red.
Here he is.
Yep. You throw them all the way back, Tiffany.
Yeah, my name is and I agree with this lady that if education is connected with money, then something is terribly wrong, because then the people, the human being, is not going in the direction what is in his heart, is going in the direction what is in his wallet. And E.F. Schumacher, who wrote the book Small is Beautiful, he said, more education can help us only if it produces more wisdom. Today we are here at the World Economic Forum, the 44th time, the 44th lesson what we have. So it's like a little school here, we come, and every year the highly educated people say we need more economic growth, which is actually destroying the future of our children. And what is very funny, there is now a movie in the cinemas here in Switzerland, and it's a movie about education. The name of the movie is Alphabet. And this guy, Erwin Wagenhofer, says, when the child is born, he has a very high capacity, he's a very skilled being. Two persons are, after education, when the child is born, 98% are highly skilled of the children. After education, only 2 highly skilled are left. What do you think about that?
David, can I? David.
Sure, Jean-Pierre.
I mean, I'd like to pick this up because I think there's a real danger, both vis-a-vis education and vis-a-vis technology, to do the same thing that we sometimes do with leaders, which is to split and say they're either good or bad, or there's one right way. I think to say that education should have nothing to do with helping you make money is as dangerous than to say that the whole purpose of education is helping you make money. I think one of the things we know about great education, when it works, is that it combines instrumental and humanistic aims, that it helps you get something done and it helps you become the person you want to be and the person you want to become. And when we lose that tension, I think we lose something. And it's the same, in the same way in which it's very easy to sort of get into a debate about is this technology. I think in Davos this year we see a lot of ambivalence towards technology as opposed to sort of the kind of unbridled enthusiasm there was in the past. And maybe this ambivalence is a positive development in the sense that we're starting to engage with it in a way that kind of allows for both enthusiasm and critique as a way to help it develop in the direction that does serve both instrumental and humanistic aim. Otherwise, I think if we start picking sides, we're really going to lose something, whether we're working online or whether we're working in universities. And I think the last thing I would add to that is we really have to distinguish pedagogy from social intervention. So as a pedagogy, so because some of you are debating, for example, MOOCs as a pedagogy, which is certainly for some things is great, for some things is less great. For some professors, it works really well. Some professors can't adapt to it. And then there's the thing of what effect does it have, for example, on academic employment or on access to institutions. Those are two very separate things. They're both important things, but it's important to not talk to them as if they were the same thing.
Add to that?
Sure.
I think, so we've had this discussion a few times now about whether education should be connected to money. And I think the issue is they're already coupled. In particular, when you look in the US and you're forced to make an economic decision at age 18 as to whether or not you should enter $200,000 worth of debt, which ends up ruining the next 10 years of your life for a lot of people. So the unfortunate fact is, while it would be wonderful if we could make a decision about education independent of economics, a lot of the systems that are in place in the US and in some other countries don't allow us to do that. So we have to ask the question, because those effects, the effects of going into $200,000 of debt don't just last while you're in school, they last for the rest of your life. So you do have to make that decision as to whether the trade-off is worth it, and they're already coupled.
More questions? Straight in the middle back there.
Hello, I'm Lakshmi Mohan and I'm studying law in Germany. And thank you very much for the session. And I want to ask you, because you're the experts here, how would you rate the higher education in Germany in the context of global competition? Because in Germany, when we finish school, we're around 18 or 19, and it takes about 8-9 years to become a lawyer or a doctor. I'm talking about these fields. So what do you think about that? That education takes 8 years or 9 years if you're a good student, and it can take longer. Do you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage?
Yeah, sure.
My wife here is a doctor. She took 12 years to become a doctor and an ophthalmologist and a specialist. It goes on and on and on and on forever. So you have to have the vocation. On top of that, you don't get paid very well. So you really need to want to be one. Now, a lawyer, that's a different question. I suppose if you take 8 years to become a lawyer in Germany, you're probably better lawyers than the United States. But there, what you do is you take a basic degree and then you go for 3 years and you become a lawyer. Then, of course, you become a patent lawyer, you become a whatever kind of lawyer, but it's not so long. But maybe that's why you have better lawyers, or perhaps why here in Germany things run somewhat better, or next door in Germany. But I have to say, this is precisely the kind of professions that are today more not at risk but challenged to get as specific. It's no longer a lawyer, like it's no longer a general practitioner with doctors. It becomes a specialist, it becomes ophthalmologist, but then it becomes somebody who's working on the retina. So then you become, either a trial lawyer, or you become, and it gets more and more and more specific. And then you find out that the more you've invested in the process, then you will get, better returns. This is why I say, again, stay with it. Stick with it. It pays. But the pertinence of what you are studying is critical. Having the title is not going to be an automatic pass for you to either get a job or get the good revenue.
Sean.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is a takeaway for me from this entire conversation with the great questions from the audience is that there is no all-encompassing right answer on this issue, that there are multiple models, multiple ways of doing things, and each will play out in terms of how they fit into ultimately people's careers and education and educational delivery models, because it's just not black or white. It's not all bricks and mortar are going to go away, or everything is going to be online, or it's not that simple. And I do think that we will see how that plays out over the next 20 or 25 years, but it will take some time. Because I know, for example, talking about medicine, I wouldn't want to have open heart surgery from a doctor who told me, it said, well, I've done it now a couple of times on my Xbox, and I'm pretty skilled at this. So, I think there is something for the rigors of the academy around certain disciplines as people go through their educational experience.
All right, we got time for a few more questions over here on the right.
Doherty, and from the United States. I'm living in Zurich, though, for a couple years. I had a question about the higher ed specifically to the United States. We've always had such a history of innovation, and we change things first, and that whole entrepreneurial thing. Why has it taken so long? If you look at, over the last few decades, the cost and what people have to pay, there's great institutions for sure, but there's a lot of them that are bloated, bureaucratic, payroll's out of control, and the kids are coming out, like you said, with just so much debt. Why? I'm just curious why you think it's taken so long to get where we are today, where it's just starting to break, where competition's going to be there?
Daphne, you want to take that?
Sure. So I think there's two parts to the question, and why has it taken so long to fix the way the academy is done now is, well, partly it's not clear what the alternatives were. The problem is that academy is by nature a service industry, and if you look at the service industries, they're the ones that have benefited the least from the kind of technological efficiencies that the other sectors have benefited from. So until there was a way that could be found to leverage technology so as to increase efficiency and scalability, I think there was it was potentially, to some extent, not completely, a lack of good alternatives. And the same thing is true for other service-oriented professions. Doctors and lawyers are also only now starting to benefit from technology in terms of improvements in efficiency. Now, as to why online education and technology has only now started to emerge as a viable solution in this space, that I think is partly a fact of some technological improvements, like, for example, cloud computing is actually really essential to the kinds of scalability that we're seeing. But I think far more fundamentally, it's a societal shift that has allowed people to become much more accepting of having both content and human interaction delivered to them in an online format. 10 years ago, pre-YouTube, pre-Facebook, people were very suspicious of this delivery model and were thinking that it was by definition inferior to face-to-face instruction. And I think we're now coming to a much more balanced and nuanced view, which is that online education has a lot of strengths and some weaknesses, and face-to-face education has strengths and weaknesses, and we need to combine the two together in a way that leverages the strengths of each and hopefully gives rise to improved quality and costs.
The young lady in the middle had her hand up.
I'm with Student Reporter, and I'm also working towards undergrad in economics. And my question is, I mean, we were talking about online education versus brick and mortar universities, but not really the way of teaching. And at my university, I feel like most often you're listening to a professor and it's a monologue. And if you're lucky, maybe there's a discussion at the end. And then a couple of later, you have an exam. And I'm not sure, but I don't think that's how it works when you start working. You're working on projects and you work with your colleagues. And I'm just wondering, how can that change? And do you agree with me that maybe the education today is a bit obsolete in that way? Thank you.
Why don't you? Okay.
So you're absolutely right, and this is exactly the change that we're now witnessing, and this is the beginning of the transformation. It hasn't hit most universities and most classes, but it's happening. I think that model that you just described of the professor, the sage on the stage, the monologue with a little bit of questions at the end, that is going to go away. And certainly in 10 years, maybe as little as 5, we're going to see almost none of that because it's an inferior model for educating people. And I think that's going to be a wonderful thing when that happens. So.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I cannot be more enthusiastic about this because I think professors aren't moving fast enough towards those more kind of participative pedagogies, and institutions aren't embracing them fast enough simply because of the numbers, because they're hiring less and less professors and sticking them in rooms with 500 students. There's two risks here. One is the sage on the stage model is still very much what we have at this point in a lot of online education, not in the best, but in a lot of it. This is a little bit like when the radio arrived and people were just sort of reading chapters of books on the radio before they actually really started thinking about how can we use this as a genre. I don't think we are yet at that point where we're looking at technology as a pedagogical genre. We're just using it as a way to sort of advertise something that we also say doesn't work very well. Then there's the question about once this disruption occurs and all of that, who's going to have access to the kind of skilled pedagogists that you are talking about? Because, you know, I have no doubt that there's a societal shift. I have no doubt that at some point in time, given generational attitudes, you know, we will be comfortable going to a surgeon who's been mostly educated online and who's paid less. Incidentally, I went to medical school for 10 years. I didn't have any debt because I went in a country which had state subsidized education. We never talk about that. But until we come to that day, I think your young people, you should engage with technology, but you should keep asking questions of your educational institutions and your governments to really improve the access and quality of education that is provided, whether it's provided online or it's provided in bricks and mortars institution. Because that day where we all happy to just interact with peers online, and it doesn't matter to our chances in life whether we have a connection on Facebook or whether we spend 2 years in the same dorm room, is still a little bit far away. It will come.
All right, we've gotten near the end of our session, and the journalist in me wants to ask a question of the entire audience, just to see how you respond. We've talked for the last 90 minutes about an industry, a social goal, education that is changing, evolving, being disrupted. But we haven't used any harder words than disruption. For instance, revolution, which some industries have seen. And in the introduction to this, we talked about $1 trillion loan bubble. And bubbles don't quietly deflate. They pop, and they cause a great deal of pain and change rapidly. So I wanted to ask this group, just raise your hand. How many of you think that the issues that we talked about tonight are going to solve themselves over the course of 10 or 15 or 20 years in gradual evolution? Hands up. Versus wrenching rapid change. All right, pretty good. Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Thank you for coming out tonight. It was a great time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.